When the sun rose on that fateful day, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Without warning or the slightest provocation, they unleashed upon their innocent neighbor the full terror and fury of a devastating blitzkrieg. The force of the Luftwaffe was revealed to a shocked country. A purposeful army floated relentlessly down from the skies to penetrate hard-held lines of defense. Swiftly, they paralyzed communications and destroyed transportation. There was no stopping this ravaging horde.
Well, that is not exactly accurate. The ravishing horde was well and truly stopped. Hello? Yes? What? Horde. Oh, I see. Horde, ravishing horde. Right then. I am Colonel Cockburn Sarkar. Cock to my friends, Sir to my troops. Now, forget what you thought you knew about World War II. This is the real story. This is the previously untold story of Halidonia's entry into the war and the world. And take it from me, every word is true, because I was there. But now it is time to get on with it and see where all this happened. Right, let us have a look at the map and see who was where.
So we'll have a look at the German forces first, the 18th Army under General George von Gluckscher. And we'll just zoom in to see where all the action took place. Now, apologies in advance to any Dutch viewers, because I'm no doubt going to butcher some of this, but we're looking at a modern-day map of the area, and we're looking pretty much in the triangle between Oss, Uden, Wegel, and Herzenbosch, where the main conflict took place. Now, the Halidonians had long planned that this was the battleground where they repulse any attack into Holland from the German borders, and had been buying up large parts of the town and the surrounding countryside for many, many years before 1940 in preparation for any potential attacks. And of course, this site had been selected by Gerard Muricator, a famous Halidonian and also the chief operating officer of the topography section. So he was the senior coot and was actually quite aged, so he was often referred to as the old coot. Now, it's fair to say that Mercator was a bit of a genius, but he was also a bit of a nutter and didn't necessarily follow all of the rules from the Halidonian government and did a few things that went rogue. Now, happily, all this was back in the 1560s, so the exposure of Halidonia that probably would have taken place today if he'd published the same stuff didn't happen. But he's very famous for writing a book, Chronologica, and that dates back, and with a kick-off point of 3,965 years before the birth of Christ, which roughly coincides with the arrival of Halidonians on the planet. He then followed that up with a second project, Cosmographica, which was a description of the whole universe. And what wasn't known at the time was it was a frighteningly accurate description of the universe. The good news was that the religious authorities at the time put his books on the list of prohibited books. In fact, he got locked up for a period of time until the Halidonian government decided to spring him. So he had a bit of a coloured past and was fond of a drink, as all Halidonians are, but he was a brilliant cartographer and topographer and had been charged with mapping the entire area around what we effectively know as Zealand back in 1940 to find great defensive positions and strong points that would protect the Halidonian homeland. Now, the other thing he did, which was far more in keeping with what he was supposed to be doing, was produced the definitive map of Europe in the late 1550s. And this map was broadly acknowledged as the greatest piece of work that had ever been produced in the field of cartography. Now, what's interesting on these maps, which I don't think anyone's picked up, but I've picked it up through my exhaustive research, is that if we zoom in particular into the regions that we're talking about in the Netherlands, we can see that the Halidonia crest has been marked in some places on the map. Here's an example here. And this is in fact the battlefield that we're talking about on the 10th of May in 1940. So he was an absolute genius in finding very good defensible positions for the protection of the Halidonia Empire, which was based in Zeeland. Now, after his brush with the church and his imprisonment, and a pretty stern warning from the Haledonian authorities, Muricator pretty much disappeared off the face of the map. No pun intended. Now, that's not uncommon for Haledonians. They tend to have to do that every 70 or so years and move around quite a lot. But he disappeared for a couple of hundred years and wasn't actually sighted again until around about 1812, 1813. And when he was sighted, it was at a tavern where he was involved in a fairly lengthy drinking session, and he'd been drinking with the Duke of Wellington, who was then an ambassador to Vienna. And during the exchange, and because he was constantly running low on funds, Muricator in fact sold the Duke a map, which he had made quite some time earlier, and which history will now show that the Duke of Wellington put to pretty good use only a year later. And that, of course, was much to Napoleon's discomfort at the Battle of Waterloo.
Do get on with it, old boy. You are disappearing down a rabbit hole.
Ah, yes, sorry about that. I'll get on with it now, Coco.
Sir, to you, thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Look, one last thing I will say is that Muricator then disappeared for many, many years, or certainly well over 100 years, and reappeared in the 1970s. And believe it or not, he appeared in the band as Dusty Hill, which was clearly taking the piss from his former occupation, and was the bass guitarist for ZZ Top. Anyway, let's get on with it. So if we have a look at the forces that were available to the Germans, the 207th, the 227th, 254th and 256th Infantry Division, the 208, the 225th and the 526th Reserves, the 1st Cavalry Division, SS Division, the 7th Flieger Division, the 22nd Luftlande Infantry Division, and the 9th Panzer Division. So it sounds like a fairly solid force, but there's a little bit more to understand about the composition of those units. Now, it's worth noting that 6 of the 7 infantry divisions were fundamentally third-wave units, and they'd only been raised in August of 1939, largely from territorial Landwehr units. Very few professional officers and almost no fighting experience, except for the few who were World War I veterans. So they weren't crack troops, and they were very inexperienced. The 526th was a pure security unit, and it had no serious combat training at all. Now, German divisions with a nominal strength of about 18,000 men were 50% larger than their Dutch counterparts, so therefore effectively had twice the firepower. But even so, for an attack, their numerical superiority was not all that impressive. So the Halidonia Army, whilst numerically way below the attacking forces, was technologically well in advance, so probably gave them a balance there. That was made up of the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions, the 2nd Recon Battalion, the 1st Special Services Battalion, the 1st Royal Armoured Division, and the 3rd Royal Artillery Regiment. Now, one of the big advantages that the Haledonian forces had over the attacking forces was the adaptive camouflage system, which effectively made them invisible to the eye until they revealed themselves, and that was used very well, much to the detriment of the German armour when the Haledonian Armoured Division suddenly appeared, as if from nowhere. So let's have a look at day one of the battle. It started on the 10th of May, 1940. So as we already know, the battle mainly took place to the east of Herzogenbosch, and that started with the build-up of German forces along the border. And we can see here some of the Dutch forces that were stationed in defensive positions, as well as the Haledonian recon units. Now, Halidonia had seen this attack coming for a long time and had in fact been working behind the scenes with the Dutch military and government to develop a very comprehensive plan. So you'll see here the Haledonian recon units moved forward and the defensive Dutch units moved north. and that was to strengthen the defence around Arnhem and further north for the extreme north attack from the German forces. This was a very well planned defensive operation. So then the German Feldjäger attack was launched, and the Ju-52s delivered the paratroopers to the cities and the bridges that the Germans were intent on capturing. And while all this was happening, the Haledonian recon boys were just bouncing up and down the line, trying to convince the Germans that there was still a full defence waiting for them. So the Feldjägers were under the impression that there wouldn't be much in the way of resistance and swept immediately into action. But they were in for a bit more of a surprise than they expected. The Dutch and Haledonian planners had anticipated this and had strongly reinforced in those back areas with Dutch troops. And at the pre-planned time, the Haledonian recon team moved all the way back to Helmond to hold there. So it appeared to the Germans that the front line was virtually devoid of any opposition troops. So the German infantry moved forward to Namojin and encountered more resistance there than they'd been led to believe would happen. But the move to the west from the other three divisions encountered no resistance whatsoever. Now the tanks of the 9th Panzer Division moved forward in support, and the German divisions moving to the west continued on now with a great sense of confidence. And the Germans moved up their reserve divisions to the border, as well as bringing artillery into range of Namojin. At this point, some of the defensive strategy started to become obvious to the German attack, as the well-concealed Dutch artillery launched into action, and also a number of reserve units of Dutch infantry started to mobilise. At the same time, the Royal Haledonian Artillery revealed itself and prepared to engage, and a number of Haledonian infantry units also moved into position ready to take up the defence. And the gates of hell were opened, and withering artillery barrage rained down upon the advancing German troops and took a severe effect. At Namojin, the German attack was stopped in its tracks, and Dutch reserves quickly moved forward to exploit that situation. But the Germans press their attack forward. The 9th Armour continues to roll westwards, as does some of the supporting infantry. Germans move up to support the attack on Namojin, and the only adverse effect is the 207th move backwards because they strolled into a pre-ranged artillery zone and took a horrible pasting from the Haledonian artillery. Germans continue to move reserves up though, and the battle presses on. At this point, the worst possible surprise for the Germans takes place. The Royal Haledonian Armour, deactivating their adaptive camouflage system, suddenly appear on the battlefield and launch into action, all the time while the devastating artillery barrage continues to rage on. The Haledonian Armour and infantry advance and engage with the German forces. Meanwhile, to the northwest, the German Feldjägers pressed forward their attack and managed to secure one of the bridges, and are giving the Dutch defenders a hard time around Dordrecht. Armoured cars for the Dutch managed to come in to support at Rotterdam. Dutch forces retired to Rotterdam, and that actually has the effect of encircling the German paratroopers, and the armoured cars are able to move further south to provide relief to some of the other beleaguered units. At this point, the weight of numbers at Namojin is played well into the Dutch favour, and the German attacking force breaks down and starts to move back behind the border. The 207th continues to retire, followed by a general lack of enthusiasm about being in the centre-west as other units fall back. The Germans do press the attack at Helmond, however, against the recon unit that again falls back, but calls on the support of Dutch units stationed at Eindhoven. Haledonian Armour moves in to support at Helmond, while they also pursue the retiring Germans. Haledonian artillery pivots to support the Dutch at Muricator bridges, and the Dutch move forward in force to fully secure the area around Namojin. And some Haledonian infantry moved forward to support forward units of the armour who were keeping an eye on the German 9th Panzer Division. And just when the attacking forces probably thought things couldn't get much worse, the Royal Haladonian Air Force suddenly enter the fray and artillery moves forward in the centre-west. The Haladonian Air Force quickly flies into attack range and engages the German retreating forces. This is the first time anyone has seen a jet aircraft in combat. Meanwhile, in the northwest, the Dutch have dealt with the Veldschenjägers in Rotterdam and are able to bring more resources to bear on the Germans at the bridge. And Haladonian forces continue to press forward, keeping the pressure on the retreating Germans. And as more units arrive at Helmond, the Germans are unable to keep hold of the ground that they have gained, and they also are forced to pull back. And the clearance at Helmond pretty much signifies the end of the first day's combat, the general continual withdrawal of the German troops as the Haladonian and combined Dutch defences reorganise themselves. The plan always being to stop at the border and just secure the defences, so certainly not a war of aggression from the Haladonians' point of view. Just wanted to make sure that there was no incursion by enemy forces. Of course, in the northwest, there are still some Veldschenjägers hanging on around Dordrecht and the bridges, but they won't get the relief that they're expecting, and they too won't augur well for them. And guys, so that is pretty much it. Thus ends day one. And as you can see, I think the incursion of the German forces probably met a surprise defence that they never imagined they would. And of course, it certainly turned the course of history. So this is episode 1 of the history of Halidonia. A little bit all over the place. We were back in the 1500s and then leapt forward into the 1940s. I'm not a history teacher, so I'm just telling it as I can best bring it to the screen. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and there were a few little gems in there, Easter eggs about some of the other details about the history of Halidonia that haven't been explicitly stated so far. So thanks for watching. I understand realistically this is probably for a limited group of subscribers who have got a bit of an interest in what's going on, but I appreciate you taking the time to watch and looking forward to getting back to the bench. I can report that today is Sunday, the 15th of November, and that this video should go up in a few hours' time once I finish doing the editing. And my plaster is off my right hand. It's been off for about 3 or 4 days now. Still quite stiff and a little bit sore, but getting a lot of movement back into it. So the next video that comes up will actually be about modelling and should be me painting the British Zulu troops for the Men of Harlech diorama. So again, take care everyone. Thank you for your time, and I will catch you in the next one.